Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Shivering Mouse Podcast. Let me scoot you over just a little bit because you are not centered. There we go. It's a little better. Alright. So, maybe it's easier to move me. Alright, so thank you so much for tuning in today. This is our Wednesday episode again because of computer trouble. I'm going to go ahead and be posting my regular story-based kind of literary roots of Disney stories on my YouTube channel instead of on my Patreon page until I get that computer up and running again, but I don't want you guys to miss out on the content that you're used to getting, so here we go with the story. Today we're going to continue along The Horse and His Boy by C.S. Lewis. So excited. This is one of my favorite Narnia stories, and it really is very underappreciated. You really don't hear it very much. Whenever anybody creates a video or recording of the Narnia stories, they're always The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, sometimes Prince Caspian, and sometimes The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. So to get the addition of this little story, I love having it included, especially because it does give you an idea kind of as to what goes on in Narnia when there's not a huge, massive war. So thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll continue the story. Shasta in Narnia. Was it all a dream? Wondered Shasta. But it couldn't have been a dream, for there in the grass before him he saw a deep, large print of the lion's right front paw. It took one's breath away to think of the weight that could make a footprint like that, but there was something more remarkable than the size of it. As he looked at it, water had already filled the bottom of it. Soon it was full to the brim, then overflowing, and a little stream was running downhill past him and over the grass. Shasta stooped and drank a very long drink, then dipped his face in and splashed his head. It was extremely cold and clear as glass, and refreshed him very much. After that he stood up, and shaking the water out of his ears and flinging his wet hair back from his forehead, began to take stock of his surroundings. Apparently, it was still very early morning. The sun had only just risen, and it had risen out of the forest which he saw low down and far away on his right. The country which he was looking at was absolutely new to him. It was a green valley land dotted with trees, through which he caught the gleam of a river that wound away roughly to the northwest. On the far side of the valley there were high and even rocky hills, but they were lower than the mountains that he had seen yesterday. Then he began to guess where he was. He turned and looked behind him and saw that the slope which he had been standing on belonged to a range of far higher mountains. "I see," said Shasta to himself. "Those are the big mountains between Archenland and Narnia. I was on the other side of them yesterday. I must have come through the pass at night. What luck that I hit it! At least, it wasn't luck really. It was him. And now I'm in Narnia." He turned and unsaddled the horse and took off its bridle. "Though you are a perfectly horrid horse," he said, and it took no notice of this remark and immediately began eating the grass. That horse had a very low opinion of Shasta as well. "I wish I could eat grass," thought Shasta. "It's no good going back to Anvard. It'll all be besieged. I'd better get lower down into the valley and see if I can get anything to eat." So he went on downhill. The thick dew was cruelly cold to his bare feet, till he came into a wood. There was a kind of track running through it, and he had not followed this for many minutes when he heard a thick and rather wheezy voice saying to him, "Good morning, neighbor." Shasta looked round eagerly to find the speaker, and presently saw a small, prickly person with a dark face who had just come out from among the trees. At least, it was small for a person, but very big indeed for a hedgehog, which was what it was. "Good morning," said Shasta, "but I'm not a neighbor. In fact, I'm a stranger to these parts." "Ah?" said the hedgehog inquiringly. "I've just come over the mountains, from Archenland, you know." "Ah, Archenland," said the hedgehog. "That's a terrible long way. Never been there myself." "And I think, perhaps," said Shasta, "that someone ought to be told that there's an army of savage Calormans attacking Anvard at this very moment." "You don't say so," said the hedgehog. "Well, think of that. And they do say that Calorman is hundreds and thousands of miles away, right at the world's end across the great sea of sand." "It's not nearly as far as you think," said Shasta, "and oughtn't something to have been done about this attack on Anvard? Oughtn't your High King be told?" "I'd like to poke in a note here, too, just as me and not Mr. Lewis. Shasta and Aravis and Bree and Hwin traveled about 2-ish days to get to the hermit's house, then Shasta has traveled about a day or two at the most since then. So 4 days away, and this hedgehog thinks that it's hundreds and thousands of miles to Calormen. So it kind of gives you a context of the fact that the hedgehog hasn't really left home in a while and really hasn't traveled far. So this, person that Shasta runs into immediately is probably not the most helpful companion when it comes to the urgency of what he needs to do. And here we continue with the story. "Certain sure, something ought to be done about it," said the hedgehog, "but, you see, I'm just on my way to bed for a good day's sleep. Hello, neighbor." The last words were addressed to an immense biscuit-colored rabbit whose head had just popped up from somewhere beside the path. The hedgehog immediately told the rabbit what it had just learned from Shasta. The rabbit agreed that this was remarkable news, and that somebody ought to tell somebody about it with a view of doing something. And so it went on. Every few minutes they were joined by other creatures, some from the branches overhead and some from little underground houses at their feet, till their party consisted of 5 rabbits, a squirrel, 2 magpies, a goat-footed fawn, and a mouse, who all talked at the same time and all agreed with the hedgehog, for the truth was that in the Golden Age, when the witch in the winter had gone and Peter was the High King and ruled at Cair Paravel, the smaller woodland people of Narnia were so safe and happy that they were getting a little careless. Presently, however, 2 more practical people arrived in the wood. One was a red dwarf whose name appeared to be Duffel. I love the dwarf names, they're all so hilarious. The other was a stag, a beautiful, lordly creature with wide, liquid eyes, dappled flanks, and legs so thin and graceful they looked as if you could break them with 2 fingers. "Lion alive!" whispered the dwarf as soon as he had heard the news. "And if that's so, why are we all still standing around here chattering? Enemies at Anvard! News must be sent to Cair Paravel at once! The army must be called out! Narnia must go to the aid of King Loon!" "Ah," said the hedgehog, "but you won't find the High King at Cair. He's on his way to the north, trouncing those giants. And talking of giants, neighbors, that puts me in mind." "Who'll take our message?" interrupted the dwarf. "Anyone here got more speed than me?" "I've got speed," said the stag. "What's my message? How many Calormens?" 200 under Prince Rapidash, and—" But the stag was already away, all 4 legs off the ground at once, and in a moment its white stern had disappeared among the remoter trees. "Wonder where he's going," said the rabbit. "He won't find the High King at Cair Paravel, you know." "He'll find Queen Lucy," said Duffel, "and then— Hello, what's wrong with the human? It looks pretty green. Why, I do believe it's quite faint. Perhaps it's mortal hungry. When did you last have a meal, youngster?" "Yesterday morning," said Shasta weakly. "Come on, then, come on," said the dwarf, at once throwing his thick little arms around Shasta's waist to support him. "Why, neighbors, we all ought to be ashamed of ourselves. You come with me, lad. Breakfast. Better than talking." Then, with a great deal of bustle, muttering reproaches to itself, the dwarf half led, half supported Shasta at a great speed further into the wood and a little downhill. It was a longer walk than Shasta wanted at the moment, and his legs had begun to feel very shaky before they had come out of the trees and onto a bare hillside. There they found a little house with a smoking chimney and an open door, and as they came to the doorway, Duffel called out, "Hey, brothers! Visitor for breakfast!" And immediately, mixed with the sizzling sound, there came to Shasta a simply delightful smell, one that he had never smelt before in his life, but I hope that you have. It was, in fact, the smell of bacon and eggs and mushrooms, all frying in a pan. "Mind your head, lad," said Duffel a moment too late, for Shasta had already bashed his forehead against the low mantle of the door. "Now," continued the dwarf, "sit you down. The table's a bit low for you, but then the stool's low too. That's right. Here's porridge, here's a jug of cream, and here's a spoon." By the time Shasta had finished the porridge, the dwarf's 2 brothers, whose names were Rogan and Bricklethumb, were putting a dish of bacon and eggs and mushrooms and a coffee pot and hot milk and toast on the table. It was all new and wonderful to Shasta, for Calormen food is quite different. He didn't even know what the slices of brown stuff were, for he had never seen toast before. He didn't know what the yellow soft thing they smeared on the toast was, because in Calormen you nearly always got oil instead of butter. And the house itself was quite different from the dark, frosty, fish-smelling hut of Arshish, and from the pillared, carpeted halls and palaces of Tashbaan. The roof was very low, and everything was made of wood. There was a cuckoo clock, and a red and white checked tablecloth, and a bowl of wild flowers, and little curtains on the thick paned windows. It was also rather troublesome having to use dwarf cups and plates and knives. This meant that the helpings were very small, but then there were a great many helpings, so Shasta's plate or cup was never empty, and was being filled every minute, and every moment the dwarves themselves were saying, "Butter, please," or "Another cup of coffee," or "I'd like a few more mushrooms," or "What about frying another egg or so?" And when they had at least all eaten as much as they possibly could, the 3 dwarves drew lots for who would do the washing up, and Rogan was the unlucky one. Then Duffel and Bricklethumb took Shasta outside to a bench which ran against the cottage wall. They all stretched out their legs and gave a great sigh of contentment, and the 2 dwarves lit their pipes. The dew was off the grass now, and the sun was warm. Indeed, if there hadn't been a light breeze, it would have been too hot. "Now, stranger," said Duffel, "I'll show you the lie of the land. You can see nearly all South Narnia from here, and we're rather proud of the view. Right away to your left, beyond those near hills, you can just see the western mountains, and round the hill away on your right is called the Hill of the Stone Table. Just beyond—" But at that moment he was interrupted by a snore from Shasta, who, what with his night's journey, his excellent breakfast, he had fallen asleep. The kindly dwarves, as soon as they noticed this, began making signs to each other not to wake him, and indeed did so much whispering and nodding, getting up and tiptoeing away, that they certainly would have waked him if he had been less tired. He slept pretty well nearly all day, but woke up in time for supper. The beds in that house were too small for him, so they made him a fine bed of heather on the floor, and he neither stirred nor dreamed all night. Next morning they had just finished breakfast when they heard a shrill, exciting sound from outside. "Trumpets," said all the dwarves, as they and Shasta all came running out. The trumpets sounded again, and the new noise to Shasta, not the huge and solemn sound of the horns of Tashbaan, nor the gay and merry sound like King Loon's hunting horn, but clear and sharp and valiant. The noise was coming from the woods to the east, and soon there was the noise of horse hoofs mixed in with it. And a moment later, the head of the column came into sight. First came the Lord Peridon on a bay horse carrying the great banner of Narnia, a red lion on a green background. Shasta knew him at once. Then came 3 people riding abreast, 2 on great chargers and 1 on a pony. The 2 on the chargers were King Edmund and a fair-haired lady with a very merry face, who wore a helmet and a mail shirt and carried a bow across her shoulder and a quiver full of arrows at her side. "The Queen Lucy," whispered Duffel. But the one that came on the pony was Corin. After that came the main body of the army, men on ordinary horses, men on talking horses, who didn't mind being ridden on proper occasions, as when Narnia went to war, centaurs, stern, hard-bitten bears, great talking dogs, and last of all 6 giants, for there are good giants in Narnia. But, though he knew they were on the right side, Shasta at first could hardly bear to look at them. There are some things that take a lot of getting used to. Just as the king and the queen reached the cottage and the dwarfs began making low bows to them, King Edmund called out, "Now, friends, time for a halt and a morsel." And at once there was a great bustle of people dismounting and haversacks being opened, and conversation beginning, when Corin came running up to Shasta and seized both of his hands and cried, "What? You here? So you got through all right? Oh, I am glad. Now we shall have some sport, and isn't it luck? We only got into the harbor at Cair Paravel yesterday morning, and the very person who met us was Turvey the Stag, with all this news of an attack on Anvard. Don't you think—" "Who is your highness's friend?" said King Edmund, who had just gotten off his horse. "Don't you see, sire?" said Corin. "It's my double, the boy you mistook for me at Tashbaan." "Why, so he is your double!" exclaimed Queen Lucy. "As like as 2 twins. This is a marvelous thing." "Please, your majesty," said Shasta to King Edmund, "I was no traitor, really I wasn't. I couldn't help hearing your plans, but I'd never have dreamed of telling them to your enemies." "I know now that you're no traitor, boy," said Edmund, laying his hand on Shasta's head. "But if you would not be taken for one another time, try not to hear what is meant for others' ears. But all is well." After that, there was so much bustle and talk and coming and going that Shasta for a few minutes lost sight of Corin and Edmund and Lucy, but Corin was the sort of boy whom one was sure to hear of pretty soon, and it wasn't long before Shasta could hear King Edmund saying in a loud voice, "By the lion's mane, Prince, this is too much. Will your highness never be better? You are more of a heart scald than our whole army together. I'd as lief have a regiment of hornets in my company as you." Shasta wormed his way through the crowd, and there he saw Edmund looking very angry indeed, and Corin looking a little ashamed of himself, and a strange dwarf sitting on the ground making faces. A couple of fawns had apparently been helping it out of its armor. If I had my cordial with me, Queen Lucy was saying, I could soon mend this, but the High King was so strictly charged me not to carry it commonly into the wars, and to keep it for only great extremes. What had happened was this. As soon as Corin had spoken to Shasta, Corin's elbow had been plucked by a dwarf in the army called Thornbutt. What is it, Thornbutt? Corin had said. Your Royal Highness, said Thornbutt, drawing him aside, our march today will bring us through the pass and right to your royal father's castle. We may be in battle before night. I know, said Corin. Isn't it splendid? Splendid or not, said Thornbutt, I have strict orders from His Majesty King Edmund to see to it that your Highness is not in the fight. You will be allowed to see it. That's a treat enough for your Highness's little years. Oh, what nonsense! Corin burst out. Of course I'm going to fight. Why, the Queen Lucy is going to be with the archers. The Queen's Grace will do as she pleases, said Thornbutt, but you are in my charge. Either I must have your solemn and princely word that you'll keep your pony beside mine, not a half-neck ahead, till I give your Highness the leave to depart, or else it is His Majesty's word. We must go with our wrists tied together like two prisoners. I'll knock you down if you try to bind me, said Corin. I'd like to see your Highness do it, said the dwarf. That was quite enough for a boy like Corin, and in a second he and the dwarf were at it, hammer and tongs. It would have been an even match, for though Corin had longer arms and more height, the dwarf was older and tougher. But it was never fought out. That's the worst of fights on a rough hillside, for by very bad luck Thornbutt trod on a loose stone and came flat down on his nose, and found when he tried to get up that he had sprained his ankle, a really excruciating sprain which would keep him from walking or riding for at least a fortnight. See what your Highness has done, said King Edmund, deprived us of a proven warrior at the very edge of battle. I'll take his place, sire, said Corin. Pshaw, said Edmund. No one doubts your courage, but a boy in battle is a danger only to his own side. At that moment the king was called away to attend to something else, and Corin, after apologizing handsomely to the dwarf, rushed up to Shasta and whispered, Quick! There's a spare pony now, and the dwarf's armor. Put it on, before anyone notices. What for? Said Shasta. Why, so that you and I can fight in the battle, of course. Don't you want to? Yes, of course, said Shasta. He hadn't been thinking of doing anything like this, but began to get most uncomfortable prickly feeling in his spine. That's right, said Corin. Over your head. Now the sword belt, but we must ride near the tail end of the column and keep as quiet as mice. Once the battle begins, everyone will be far too busy to notice us. The next chapter is The Fight at Anvard, and I hope you'll tune in for it. I love the contrast between Shasta being super, super, super nervous about everything, and Corin being just like, yeah, I got this. I've never fought anybody before, but I'm pretty sure I can handle it. Never mind that these are all seasoned, trained warriors, and I'm a prince who sits on a cushion and eats, what was it they said he eats? Sherbet. That was it. Sherbet. Nope. He's got this, guys. I don't see anything bad coming out of this, right? Well, we'll find out next week. Thank you so much for tuning in. And again, if you'd like to support us, and if you'd like to continue to get the story segments of my podcast after my computer is fixed, the only way you'll be able to get those segments is by subscribing to my channel. So don't hesitate to subscribe at patreon.com/shiveringmouse. For at least $1 a month, you get these story segments along with updates to the Patreon page and my personal blog. So thank you so much for tuning in, and have a safe week.